Retro.
Hey, you scruffy nerf herders. This is Catherine Tabor, Mission Veo from Knights of the Old Republic, and you're listening to Jay and Dennis on Podcast Stardust. Aren't you lucky?
Welcome to Podcast Stardust. This is the fully armed and operational podcast dedicated to Star Wars news, reviews, and discussion. I'm Dennis Keithley.
And I'm Jay Krebs.
And this episode features the next installment in our Darth Bane book club. But before we get into the latest that's happening on Korriban, Jay, you want to remind everybody what our social media contacts are?
Yes, so you can find us in this galaxy on Facebook and Instagram at Podcast Stardust.
All right, the dish is line. The signal's boosted to maximum output. The shield is down, and we are now broadcasting to the galaxy. So, as I said just a second ago, we're getting into part 4 of the Darth Bane book club. Jay, I know you got a summary for us, so you want to go ahead and get into that and get this discussion started.
Yes, let's do it. So in this edition of the Darth Bane book club, we step inside the brutal world of the Sith Academy, where power is earned through pain, rivals lurk at every turn, and survival demands more than strength alone. As Bane faces new challenges, both physical and psychological, we're introduced to dangerous new players and deeper questions about what it really means to embrace the dark side. From calculated manipulation to raw, unrestrained power, these chapters explore the cost of ambition in a system designed to break or remake you.
Yeah, so we got 3 chapters here, chapters 10 through 12 that we're going to go through here, and they're much more of a whole, I think, as compared to some of the previous editions of the podcast that we've done covering some of the chapters and things that happened here. But with that having been said, kick it off, Jay. Where are we going with this discussion?
Yeah. Okay. So there's a few things that we definitely need to talk about with this, as we were just talking about. There's the academy hierarchy and the way that it's set up. So we're definitely going to need to break that down. And there's some rivals that are introduced here, and the way that Bane learns his place in everything. And then there's some other things that we need to address as well. So let's just jump right in with chapter 10. So Bane is at the point right now where he is really kind of getting into where he is with his abilities. And he's diving in with the ability to be able to run 5 kilometers without even like getting breath, winded. And he is leaping these big, amounts of distances. And then he is battling against his rivals, and he's feeling really, really good about all of the things that are going on. And so with that in mind, he is starting to focus really on the physical aspects, I guess you could say, of using the dark side. And he's kind of set aside those ancient teachings that he was originally so completely enamored with, and that he thought that he was being so far above his co-students, I guess you could say, by paying attention to those. And now he's kind of falling into that same lure of the power and the abilities as his competitors. So he's getting really caught up in academy life and competition at this point. So what do you make of that?
Yeah, that's one of the things that stood out to me in this rereading here, is that he entered the academy as having all this promise and all this raw ability, but he was behind so many of the other students because they'd been training there forever, since they were little, and he came in as a young adult. And so he made up for that by immersing himself in the text. He did the Malcolm, Ian Malcolm thing from Jurassic Park. It's like, when he criticizes them for just standing on the shoulders of giants instead of earning the knowledge for himself, he went and he earned it. But once he found himself catching up and somehow surpassing them, it's kind of like, yep, don't need that stuff anymore. And you can't help but wonder if the way that these 3 chapters play out, if he hadn't spent a little bit more time doing that, if maybe he would have found some of the answers he was seeking along the way.
Mhm.
That, and so that's kind of looking ahead a bit there, but it is one of those things that it's almost glossed over in this chapter about how he put that stuff aside, and it's just like, but if you've read this book before and you come back, it's like, oh, you read this line, you're like, yeah, mistake. Really,
Mhm.
really shouldn't have given up that practice. It's one of the things that, in addition to your natural talent, set you apart from everybody else.
Right, right. And and as we're going to find out a little bit later here, and I don't want to spoil that for anybody, but he does end up, kind of refocusing on some of those old texts. But I think it's kind of interesting that when he does, and again, it's going to be hard for us to separate out, one chapter from another because a lot of these things do kind of blend together. There's a point where he is in Cordis's office, and Cordis is very uh focused on things like baubles and jewels and whatnot, and he's got all of these ancient texts and archive type things in his office as well, and that's the one thing that Bane still drew his eye to.
Right.
And they made a point to, or Carption made a point to point that out, that he's still like, oh yeah, he's got all of this here too. So at that point, I don't know if he thought that Cordis really valued those as a source of knowledge, or if they were just more trinkets for him, for Cordis. But one thing that struck me about this transformation, if you will, from Bane being so enamored with those ancient texts versus now he's kind of into the academy life and competition, and he's so caught up in that, is that it brings me back even to what Maul said to Devin in Shadowlord, what we've been talking about. You've been indoctrinated.
Mhm.
And so now, Bane is kind of being lured into that kind of indoctrination, if you will. And there is a daily routine, and it's something that Bane truly enjoys because it challenges him physically, but not in the same ways that the mines on Apatros challenged him. So he's using different muscles and muscle memory. And he even points that out. He said that, at the end of the day, he was exhausted in a different way. And it wasn't from just the mindless mining that he did. It was because you had to constantly be thinking about your opponent or thinking about the mental aspect of things. And I did really appreciate how they broke down the lightsaber battles and the lightsaber forms. And I
Mhm.
thought that it was so cool that Kasim, as the lightsaber master and the blade master, really paid attention to how each of the students at the academy fought, and also the way that their body style was and what type of form would fit them best. And so Bane goes into that a little bit, is that he picked, I think it was form 5 for Bane, because he knew he was strong, he was formidable, and it would use his strength and power to his advantage and to his ability. So I loved that. And I thought it was so unique how they talked about the training sabers with those Pelco barbs, and the
Right.
way that it would mimic how they would be in combat with, yeah, it could hurt if you got hit by one of these, but it would instantly make that part of your body that you got hit with go numb, almost like being severed with a lightsaber. So the lengths at which the academy went to truly prepare the students in that way, I thought was pretty impressive. But what stood out to you about that whole setup of the way that the academy and the fighting style and Kasim in general was presented?
Well, there's a lot of stuff here that at the academy that I appreciate, and especially since it's from Bane's perspective, that yeah, he may have put aside this whole study and devotion to this ancient Sith scrolls and teachings that he could find therein, but he still is very contemplative in this entire experience. Where, he notes that the lightsaber is not just a weapon, but it's an extension of the user and their command of the Force. And then he's noted that drills are designed to free up the mind so that he can use the Force. And so he's learning a lot of things. And then he even makes other observations that the other students there at the academy don't seem to be making, that there's no camaraderie here. He's used to that while he was a soldier, but he comes to realize that it's here at the academy. It's like the other students are just about exhibiting their skill and placing themselves in the hierarchy without really understanding all the nuance of what they're doing. But he's also figured out that there's no point in making friends here because it's an attachment. And I thought this was fascinating because what we know about the Jedi and the discussion of attachment
Yeah.
is that, he says that he's not making friends because personal attachments could only hold him back. And he was thinking about all the different chains that, and that's part of the, my chains are broken. He's thinking about his abusive, uncaring father, the grueling shifts that they worked in the mines, the debts they had to the corporation. These are all things that were holding him back. And then he's on a broader sense, thinking about the Republic's promises of a better life, the Jedi's vow to get rid of injustice, and even the Gloomwalkers, because when he was looking out for them, he was not looking inward in what he could do in this situation. So that is attachment, which is such a fun comparison to the Jedi, because they looked at attachment as something that would drive you to the dark side, whereas we have the founder of the Rule of Two is looking at attachment as it's not useful because it doesn't give him any power. It doesn't feed his passion in this regard. All it does is it holds him back from being the best that he can be. So it's kind of like maybe the Jedi had it wrong this entire time with this passion thing, because here you have this Sith who's just saying like, yeah, I don't need to worry about, attachment. Yeah, that doesn't serve me at all.
Right.
I don't know. That's not fair to say. I don't think the Jedi were completely off base with that. But to more specifically answer your question, we had Harry Potter and the like that's come up after this type of a book. And of course, we've had plenty of instances in the Clone Wars and other Star Wars stories talking about Academy life here. But just to see it's an entire school of Slytherin here at Korriban, right? They're all about how great they can be at the expense of everybody else.
It's true. Yeah. And you pointed out a lot of things about attachment too that I think are definitely important to compare and contrast, because I picked up on that too. The Jedi, as you said, they have a different view, but they basically avoid attachment to maintain balance.
Mm-hmm.
And Bane is trying to avoid it he sees it as vulnerability. It's a weakness. As you
Right.
said, he sees friends as liabilities, loyalty is exploitable, and dependence on anyone limits you. So, again, the chains are broken kind of thing. And the chains are broken mantra comes up a couple of times in these particular chapters. So let's kind of switch a little bit, since we're talking about the lightsaber battling and the way that things are set up that way with the hierarchy. So there's this whole idea that treachery and doing things underhandedly against your fellow academy students is kind of expected in some ways, but it's only the stupid ones that get caught.
Right.
But there is a very controlled way that they allow students to call each other out, and it's by challenging each other in the lightsaber battles. And so they have these, and Kasim runs these for the academy students so that they can, I don't know if you want to call it like take out their frustrations, or, almost be like a pecking order sort of thing to prove who's the stronger one against the others. And so Bane is then, at first didn't want to challenge anybody. And then he even says that he lost a few rounds here and there and everywhere. And he has even fought some formidable opponents, but he decides that he wants to call out this McCurth named Foharg and to see how he can fare against him. So let's take that into consideration as far as what happens to Bane during and after this fight. So what do you think overall about the fact that, Bane kind of bided his time a little bit before calling out Foharg? And what do you think was his true motivation in challenging him, other than to try to pit his skills against this other student?
Well, it goes back to our discussion of the earlier part of the chapter where he's finally caught up and started surpassing all these students, and he realizes that you can improve your standing by winning. You can, amongst the hierarchy of the students, And yeah, you can also suffer a little bit by losing, but he knew that when he was first there, he had really nothing to gain by accepting challenges and just losing, because everyone already had a low opinion of him and he wasn't going to win. So only things were only going to get worse. But he's now in the position where he can issue, and he already lost to Foharg in an earlier fight.
Right.
And now he started to catch back up. And so he's kind of gotten caught up in this notion, getting away from the text and getting into the prestige that so many of the other students that are in. Like I said, they're all Slytherins at this point. And so he makes that challenge, and it really goes fantastically for him until he makes one slip. He pretty much dominates the fight until Foharg makes a change in form at the last second, and Bane gets struck in the arm, and that goes numb. So I think the point is that he was trying to cement a place in the hierarchy there, and he went about it the way he does. He's calculating and he anticipates things, but there's one thing that he just didn't have an account for yet, and so that's what cost him here in the fight.
Yes. And for me too, we've been following Bane all along. We know that when he was recruited into the academy, that he was brought on much, much older than a lot of the other recruits. So at first he felt like he needed to catch up. And then all of a sudden he sees himself surpassing everyone. And watching this recruit and that recruit kind of falling behind his skills and that type of thing. So you're right. He was very calculating to the point where he did bide his time and waited to challenge Foharg until he thought he was probably ready. But then when he took that blow that he, as you said, didn't expect, it completely put him off kilter and off balance. And it just rocked his boat in such a way that he exploded, in that he wasn't going to accept that. And there was no way that he was going to accept weakness. There was no way that he was going to accept his own weakness, I should say, and his own failure, because he feels not only that he has something to prove, but again, to break those chains. And so I think that that's the big part of why he kind of lost it, if lack of a better term, when after Foharg started to ridicule him, and basically he told him, "You are the bane of the Sith." That broke something in him, because the way that Foharg said it was very reminiscent of the way that his father used to say it to him. So, as we were talking about, again, we can draw so many correlations between Bane and Maul, in that Bane is also defined by his tragedy in life, much as Maul was. And so that little trigger right there just was the breaking point for Maul. And he's like, no one uses that name against me. Bane wanted to use that as a source of strength, where Foharg was using it as a source of weakness. And so he exploded in the Force, starts to force choke this McCurth, Foharg. Kasim very calmly says, "Stop." And what does Bane do? Doesn't stop. And he ends up killing Foharg. So at this point, now, all of the other students are like, what the heck just happened? Like, this is not supposed to happen. People are not supposed to die. These Sith trainees are few and far between as it is. And Bane even laments about that later on that evening, in questioning some of the things that he did in the ring, and obviously ultimately killing Foharg. So, this sends Bane on this downward spiral of, questioning what he did, until he goes to see Cordis. So,
let me interject.
How do you feel about that? Yeah, I was just going to say, like, how do you feel about this whole fight and what led up to it?
Well, here's the thing. It's Bane was just talking about how attachments can only hold him back. And in a way, he was right. Attachment is Foharg's undoing. He's attached to the prestige. He's attached to his jealousy. Because one of the things it points out is that these masters, especially like Kasim, are all interested in Bane and giving him private tutoring throughout. They're giving him private lessons, and the other students resent that. They're attached to their position, they're attached to the hierarchy and finding their place in it. And so Foharg is acting out his resentment on Bane. And then, as you pointed out, he taunts him with his name and goes too far. It sets Bane off, just as Bane is kind of attached to who he is and his legacy and his name, and overcoming all of these chains that we just recited earlier, the abusive father and that type of thing. And when he's brought back down to that, it's the no, I've overcome these things. You're not going to drag me back down again, which in a way is its own form of attachment in this situation. So yeah, that is what caused him to, overreact, so to speak. Although, getting into the next chapter, Cordis and Cassine didn't see it that way. But anyways, that may be our cue to move on to the next chapter. But anyways, your response.
Yes, absolutely. And so I think that, again, Bane, with him hitting that breaking point against Foharg, it was his way of getting through those chains. Because here's the thing about the Academy, that there's a lot of contradiction, I think, that Bane is looking at in terms of the way that the hierarchy is set up, the training is regulated, and this is what he's going through in chapter 11 before he meets with Cordis at the end of chapter 10, is he's laying awake thinking, okay, that I needed to do this because there's these dueling limits, there's all this restraint, there's all of these artificial stopping points. I could have stopped at Dunmok, which they say is, the ultimate battle mode that you can be in, but he chose to go much further. And so when he goes to see Cordis, he originally thinks that he's going to be reprimanded for the things that he's done. And so he even goes so far as to say to Cordis, well, Kasim saw what was going on. He could have stopped me. Why didn't he? And Cordis says, because he wanted to see what would happen and if you would stop or if you would be strong. So Bane's left to think, okay, well, yeah, through victory, my chains are broken and you're wanting me to do this, but yet you're setting all of these other artificial limits. So I think that, again, this is setting Bane up to see the hypocrisy of the Brotherhood of Darkness, and that there's no consistency to the way that they're treating who is supposed to become their highest, Sith Lords and Masters.
Right. What's in the background of all this is exactly why the okay, I should back up. In the background of all this is that the reason why all these Sith called a truce and created this Brotherhood of Darkness is that they were weakening themselves, because with the notion that, you would have lesser Sith that would team up and take the master, which would then dilute the power, because not one of those apprentices were capable of being the master one-on-one, but they get a number of them that can do it. Well, now the Sith have diluted their top level strength in this. And so, not to get too far ahead in this book, but now the Sith are expected to achieve their full potential. And Bane notices that, you're supposed to elevate yourself, but at the same time, not take out the competition. And he's prepared to go into this meeting with Cordis. He doesn't even know what's going to happen. And he's already formulating the arguments. And so when Cordis says, you're responsible for Foharg's death, and he's like, that's not true. Foharg is responsible for his death because he was not prepared. And I've basically exposed him. I'm paraphrasing this. And that's essentially what we come to know is the rule of two. You don't even have to get to this book to know that, right? It's the idea is that there is a master to embody the power and a student crave it in this situation. And when the student is powerful enough to take on the master, he does so. And if he wins, well, then that's how the Sith continue to evolve. Whereas this type of thinking is what held the Sith back and allowed the Jedi to defeat them in the first place. So it's Bane doesn't have all the answers and he hasn't put everything into place yet, but you can see him going through these chapters like, how does this place really work? Because it doesn't make sense. They say one thing and then they have us do another.
That's what I'm saying. It's so contradictory. Like they're enforcing these limits, but yet they're also encouraging him to be strong and not merciful. So it's like, what is he supposed to think? And, where is all of this going? And he even goes so far as to question Cordis about the Sith'ari And
Yep.
Cordis stops and says, "Where did you hear that term?" And so he explains that, and that, the Sith will one day be led by this perfect being. And he kind of wonders if this other Academy student, Kasim, or not Kasim, sorry,
Sirak.
Sirak, thank you. Sirak is possibly the Sith'ari, because everyone else is saying that he could be. He's been there. This Sirak has been there for 20 years.
He's been
So
trained for 20 years. We don't know
has
exactly
been
how long.
trained for 20 years. Yes.
Right. That we don't know how long he's been at the academy. Yeah. And it was kind of cool that we introduced us to him at the end of the last chapter, because he kind of follows Bane after he kills Foharg and is like,
Mhm.
I've noticed you now. And Sirak doesn't challenge anybody because he's at the top of the hierarchy at this academy, but he because there's nothing to be gained for it. He knows he's at top, but he waits for people to challenge him, to pull on Superman's cape, so to speak.
Yeah.
And now, so this is what's looming in the background, is that there is this Zabrak Sith that everyone's got their eye on, and there's rumors that he might be this Sith'ari, and Bane is not quite so sure.
Right, exactly. And I love how Sirak just tempts Bane when he
Mhm.
says, you will challenge me at some point, and I'm just waiting for that day, just to tempt him.
Mhm.
And it's almost like, I'm above you, and you will try, but you will fail, kind of thing. And so I think that,
You will try, Anakin.
you will try, Anakin,
Yeah.
you will try, yes. But at this point, after Bane leaves Cordis, he starts having these horrible, nightmares about his father dying, and then Foharg, and then they morph together. And then chapter 11 ultimately ends with the dream memory, if you will, of the last night of uh, Bane, or Dessa's dad's life, realizing that he was actually the one that killed him.
Yeah.
And he was wishing that his dad would die after this horrible beating that his dad had placed upon him. And then Bane kind of loses it after that. And he really not I wouldn't say he loses his passion, but he loses his way in a lot of the sense of the word. So how do you feel about the way that Bane just slid backwards in his doubt about himself, and everything that he was going through at that point, as we get into chapter 12?
Well, it's still another subtle discussion of attachment in this situation.
Mhm.
When, in the previous chapter, when he says that he realizes that personal attachments can only hold him back, he was thinking of more along the lines of things like friendship and companions and the like. But what he is not considering is that he doesn't think of himself as this brutal monster, right? And
Yes.
so when he has no control over his emotions and he kills Foharg, or he suffers that brutal beating at the hands of his father because he's eaten too much food, and his father's going about how expensive that is, and he's in more debt now than he was at the beginning of the month, and Bane standing up to him and telling him that, if you're going to beat me, make sure you do it good, because before long you won't be able to do it. And then when he spends all night going, I want you to die, I want you to die, I want you to die, and he imagines his, crushing his heart, and then his dad dies of a heart attack overnight.
Mm.
And so he has this attachment to being in control, to not being the murderous type. And he, that shatters and he becomes afraid of his own power. And he has this other discussion, even he has this thought that there's this possibility that passion is fueling the dark side. He realizes that when he's at his angriest, when he's feeling the most hate, is when he feels the most powerful, and it feels right. But then he begins to wonder if it's not like a feedback loop, that the dark side is also then feeding his passion, and it's stirring him up to do things like what he just did to Foharg. And so he's also fearing this loss of control there in this regard. So he's got a lot on his mind at the end of this chapter.
Yeah, for sure. And
Mhm.
I think it's interesting how they talk about Bane being, it's almost like he's in transition at this point, because you brought
Mhm.
up the fact that he said that he wasn't this horrible person. He even mentions that he never felt himself to be a cruel person. And so he's really kind of having weird existential crisis at this point, as you said, because he pushed things too far and he lost his control. And that scared him to the point where, yes, he could justify it, but is it something that he was controlling or was controlling him? And so his pullback on that is really an internal conflict. And what and I brought this up a couple of times before too, with the dark side feeling cold. And he references that as a cold chill, when he thinks about the things that has happened. Or there was a couple of times where they mentioned this cold chill, or him feeling chilled even though he was sweating, kind of thing. And so again, I kind of go back to that idea that, does the dark side feel cold to those that have not completely given themselves up to it? And so I think that that's maybe, as Bane backslid a little bit, why he was feeling that. So yeah, so there's, just a lot going on with him. He's really unfocused. He's unstable at this point, very misaligned with what is going on with him, on the dark side of things, and his passion and his abilities. And in chapter 12, 3 weeks later, he's trying to learn this new sequence with Kasim and the Blade Master. And Kasim can tell, Bane's not drawing on the Force as much, and it's causing him trouble learning this new sequence. And Kasim keeps telling him, you've got to draw on the dark side. And basically he just throws up his hands and says, I can't do this with you. You can't, I'm not going to train you until you get yourself right, essentially. And so, how do you think that Kasim withdrawing from Bane at this point is affecting him as well? So he's had this blow to his abilities, or in his dark side, conscience, if you will. And now he's going through this sort of horrible downward spiral. And now Kasim is pulling away from him as well. So what do you think that's doing to him at this point?
Yeah, Bane's in crisis here in this chapter, because he's trying to figure out basically how to cheat the system when it comes to the dark side. He's not willing to engage his passion, which is where the dark side draws his power from, because he's afraid of losing that control again. And it comes to a head when Kasim is like instructing him on that sequence, and then he screws something up and he ends up getting hit in the chest with that blade with the pico barbs on it, or pelco, whatever it's called. And Bane says, "I'm sorry, master, I'm going to go practice this sequence." And Kasim flat out calls him a fool. It's like, "Oh, you think that's what's going to solve this problem?" And he basically puts it to Bane like this, which is, the whole point of the sequences is to free up your mind so that you can use the Force. It's the Force that you're going to drive into this, and that's how you're going to win. It's the Force that allows you to defeat your opponents. And if you aren't using the Force, you're holding back. And I'm not going to train you if you're not going to do this. And so Bane, he's reluctant at this point. He is trying to have it his way, which really isn't how the dark side works in this situation. Is that you can't fake it. You can't it's like trying to run a car without gas in this situation. He's trying to just basically roll it downhill and achieve the same result. And Kasim's telling him that that's not going to work.
Right. Or trying to run a car without any oil in it.
Right.
You can use the gas and it might kind of get you, but you'll eventually burn out. That's for sure. So yeah, so Bane is definitely, as we said, existential crisis. He's in transition. He's got to figure things out. And there's a lot of that has to do with the way that the hierarchy of the academy is set up, and just that contradiction, as we said, to everything that he has learned, and then what he thinks that it should be. And that eventually sets us up for, where we'll be in the future. But let's switch gears so that way we can talk about the end of chapter 12 here. And so we've got Lord Khan, and he's on the Nightfall at Bretnall 4. And so the thing of it is that he gets visited by Kopej, and he's trying to report to him something, and he doesn't want to do it in front of Lord Khan's shipmates and his crew. And Lord Khan says that they've been very well trained. They know I can trust them completely. So say whatever you need to say. And so Kopej is really kind of beside himself. And he says, "We've been wiped out. How can this happen?" So he explains that there is this army of lights. There's Jedi, there's Padawans, there's Masters, and they've all banded together where they used to be all over the Republic space, defending all these different worlds, but now they've all come together and they're calling themselves the Army of Light. And I just thought it was hilarious because Lord Khan is like, the Army of Light? Are you kidding? Like, what is this?
Mm-hmm.
They're going to combat the Brotherhood of Darkness. Okay, kind of thing. But it's not until like Kopej is like, no, this is like serious. We need to really take this seriously. So then he starts to question Lord Khan and he says, do you think that we should get all of our apprentices? Like, we should do this, we should do that. And Lord Khan specifically tells him, we are not touching those students at the academy on Korriban. They are too valuable to utilize in this way. So what do you make of this new revelation that the Jedi, now led by General Hoth, are this Army of Light to combat the Brotherhood of Darkness, and Khan's reaction to that? And also the way that he looks at the value, I guess you could say, of those students at the academy.
Okay, so that's a bunch of questions. Let me tackle those. So first off, it's he's this portion of the chapter starts with him going, this has been too easy. Why are we just conquering all these planets? We get in there, we engage the Republic forces. I barely detect any Jedi. We fight them, we start winning, they retreat, and world after world is falling to them. They've got command of these two different tradeways, and so he's suspecting something is wrong. But then the irony of it is when Kopej tells him why this is because the Jedi all banded together and conquered Rusan, and that that's why so they realize that scattering themselves, it's almost like a Sith thing, right? When the Sith were not organized and working together, they were losing. And once they started working together, they were winning. The Jedi follow the same tactic. They band all together and they go out and they take Rusan, which is this majorly important world to the Sith. And so it's and then Khan doesn't want to believe it, it's kind of like the same thing Bane was just going through. He knows what the answer is, but he does not want to believe it. So the question becomes, well, then can we cheat this? And then, so they finally get around to the idea of putting together the Sith army in one place. But backing up, the idea of the Army of Light, the Jedi calling themselves an army of anything, gives you a big hint that this is also a bad idea.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously the Clone Wars is centuries into the future, but the Jedi never, they learn this lesson and they forget it. And again, I don't want to talk about things that necessarily come up later in the book, but here they are, they're banding together not to serve the Force, but as Khan points out, they're here to wipe out the Sith.
Right.
And so that's an issue unto itself. But then, they come around to the idea, as you were, I think the last question you asked about, well, we're going to get all of our assassins from these worlds, and we're going to get all of our marauders from these worlds. And I can't remember which are which on which worlds. And so, but we're not getting our best apprentices from Korriban. Why not? Because when they get in this environment, they're going to see opportunities to set themselves apart from the others, to take out their competition and to elevate themselves. And they're not ready for that yet. And so they're already aware that there's a problem with our system, that if we give the apprentices this much rope, they'll end up hanging us with it, because they'll band together to elevate themselves. And that's what got us into the trouble in the first place when it came to trying to fight off the Jedi, because we were doing it to ourselves. So it's very insightful, but they do have their own flaws.
Right. Yeah, and getting back to what you said about the Army of Light, I mean, we've heard it a million times that the Jedi are supposed to be defenders of the peace, not warriors, right?
Right.
We've heard that a million times before. So it goes back to that, always learning and going in cycles, but never actually learning from those things,
Yep.
the hubris, if you will. So, so that brings up the question, is the Academy truly trying to create powerful Sith or just controllable ones? Because as you said, they're afraid that, they're going to do all of this and they're going to go off on their own and they're not ready for that. So, are they just trying to control them?
Yeah, this is still early times for the Brotherhood of Darkness, and they don't, maybe they should have a bigger council meeting amongst the Brotherhood. I'm not even sure what to call it, but Cordus knows and Kassim knows that they're on Korriban. The apprentices have already set up a hierarchy, and they're already battling for the top spot, and they're already doing themselves off, each other off in the corners when they can get away with it. And Bane is killing another apprentice there in their fighting circle. And so on the one hand, Khan's right that if we throw him into this other position, it's only going to amplify that. But it's not like they're teaching him a different way. And Bane openly got encouraged to do this just a moment ago.
Right.
And so it's like, you all got to get on the same page in this.
Exactly.
The notion that, we created this Brotherhood of Darkness and they're still rivals. Cordus and Khan hate each other. And Kopej. Yeah, it's actually, I guess it's Kopej and Cordus hate each other. And so, we'll find out in the aftermath of this that Cordus is delighted that Bane is failing because he's getting one up on Kopej, who brought him here in the first place. And so this idea that, again, these are supposed to be the future of the Brotherhood. And so that is a rule of two idea that, the next generation is going to be more powerful than this one. But, you're not giving them the appropriate teaching to make all this happening. They don't really understand what they're supposed to be doing. They're giving their apprentices such conflicting messages.
For sure. Yeah, because if the Sith believe that power is everything, why does their own system seem afraid of unleashing it?
Right.
So there's definitely that too. So yeah. So, and you already answered my question. I was going to ask you which system or both, the Army of Light and Brotherhood of Darkness, is compromising their philosophies in order to win the war. Well, we know that the Jedi are.
Yep.
And so obviously, based on our conversation just now, so is the Brotherhood of Darkness in a lot of ways too. And that eventually obviously becomes their downfall, with Bane establishing the rule of two. So there's a lot going on behind the scenes here. And Bane is definitely at a very important impasse in his journey to the dark side. So before we wrap it up, is there anything else that you want to touch on in any of these chapters that we may have missed?
I think we hit all the points that we need to hit on this. And there's some, we end like every one of these episodes about Bane talking about there's some really important stuff that's just about to happen. It's all important. But this is such a good setup here. And I'm really glad we got to talk about this way, because when you just read through it, it's kind of like when we do our movies series and we talk about the movie, one of the Star Wars movies in 10 to 15 minute segments, how we get to really think about how that influences the rest of the movie. This is doing the same thing for this book. It's helping me think about the rest of the book in a way I haven't really thought about before necessarily. Of course, the problem is that not everyone who's listening to this has read the book before, so I don't want to spoil it for anybody. But
Right.
So trying to be guarded about what I say, but still trying to hit some themes and highlights as we go forward with this conversation. But yeah, this has been fun, Jay.
Yeah, absolutely. And every month, I find myself so looking forward to diving into these chapters again and revisiting these, because as you said, it's just, there's so much to unpack when you break them down into these smaller segments this way. So I'm so grateful that we're doing this for sure. All right. So I think we're ready to wrap it up. Thank you all for joining us for this episode of Podcast Stardust and this installment of the Darth Bane Book Club. So make sure you keep up with us for next month as we hopefully dive back into the next couple of chapters. And so before we go, just want to remind you that you can subscribe to the show on RetroZap as well as many other places. But we hope you enjoyed this episode. And if so, as I said, please subscribe, like, rate, and subscribe on all of your different podcatchers, basically wherever you can download podcasts. We should be there. And if we're not, let us know. And Dennis has been really great on getting us everywhere we need to be. And RetroZap.com does have all of our past episodes. And you can also check out all the other great shows on the RetroZap network as well. And while you're thinking about subscribing, also rate and review. And if you'd hit us up on Apple Podcasts and give us that 5-star review, it really helps us out with those algorithms. But also helps us out if you would share these posts on social media with your friends. So would you remind everyone, Dennis, where they can do that?
So we're on Facebook and Instagram at Podcast Stardust. We also have Pinterest boards that are discussing a lot of things that are Star Wars. The show is available on YouTube and YouTube Music, audio only. We don't have any video. And if you got a longer comment that you'd like to make that's not ideal for social media or just prefer email in general, reach out to us at podcaststardust@gmail.com. And if you're looking for t-shirts and the like with our logo on it, you can head over to the link in the show notes for our store at TeePublic. Jay, what is going on in the world of cosplay?
Yeah, so you can definitely catch me on my Instagram, which is at j.snipscosplay. And my main is Ahsoka from the Clone Wars, but you can also catch me as several different Star Wars characters as well, including Hera, the Fourth Sister, and my original concept Mandalorian. So, Dennis, you want to remind everybody what's coming up on the news or coming up on the show? You can tell we've been doing this for a long time tonight.
That's right. So coming up on the show on Friday, the plan is to get into recent Star Wars news. But since we're flipping back to our regular schedule, there may not be much. And we plan on doing some preview for The Mandalorian and Grogu that's coming out next week. And then on Monday, we are returning to our Clone Wars rewatch. So we're in mid-season 3, or I guess the back quarter of season 3 of that. So we'll be discussing that. But with that said, thanks for listening to episode 1030 of Podcast Stardust, everyone. Have a great rest of your week. And until next time, may the Force be with you.